Hello. Back in the late 90s, before the turn of the millennium, I believe, we were invited to do a television show, Ronda London Live here in Canada. And on that program, we were brought in as the experts on what it's like to be in a cult and then to leave a cult. And a professor called Lorne Dawson was brought in as the academic world's speaking to the subject of cults and mind control. And Professor Dawson, we didn't know much about him at the time, but if you'll allow me to promote two of his works. Professor Dawson still works, I believe, in the sociology department at the University of Waterloo here in Ontario. And his specialty has become Islamic radicalization and extremism. That's what he seems to concentrate on in the last decade or so. But back then, 20 years ago, he was promoting this book, Comprehending Cults, the Sociology of the New Religious Movements. And he'd already published this, Readings in the Study of New Religious Movements, Cults in Context. So if you can get Professor Dawson's works, they'll benefit you immensely. On that show, we prepared a document too. This one, Destructive Religious Groups. I'll be glad to send you a PDF of it. And I'd like to read this to you because the argument is quite tight, and therefore I'll read straight from the document. First of all, what are we aiming at here? It's how to recognize religious groups that are destructive first, and it's also how to help people who are in them or exiting them. First of all, we have to answer the question, how do I know if a religion is dangerous or destructive? Cults have often been defined as religious protest movements because of their deliberate departure from the beliefs of the dominant culture or religions. But in a multicultural society or a poly-religious society such as the Western world and specifically this area of Canada, in a multicultural society such as ours, this sociological definition of cults is inadequate. For this reason, we do well to note Stephen Hassan's definition. Any group that engages in outright deception to pursue its ends, whether religious or secular, in its apparent orientation, I define as a destructive cult. Let me read that again. Any group that engages in outright deception to pursue its ends, whether religious or secular, in its apparent orientation, I define as a destructive cult. Now, Stephen Hassan, some of you are aware of already, I know. Combating Cult Mind Control, one of the best books on the subject. This specializes not just in defining what mind control looks like in the cult situation, but in the rescue and recovery of people from destructive cults. So yes, Stephen Hassan is one of the major sources on this subject. So I'll be quoting him frequently in here. Any religion that will not tolerate criticism, whether from members or outsiders, is engaging in a form of mind control. That is, it is attempting to control the flow of information that reaches its members. This is essential if the recruiting process upon which such groups depend, that is, the cutting off people from any form of objective information, is essential to the growth. Because, of course, the growth of such groups, the numerical blessing, as they usually describe it, the blessing of God is dependent upon closing off external sources. Stephen Hassan points out that he would never have joined the Moonies, that is the Unification Church, had he known their underworld and political connections, but he didn't. Most Jehovah's Witnesses, we know this to be a fact, who finally do leave, they leave because they find out the truth about the Watchtower's past and discover God's organization is capable of cover-up like any worldly organization. A cover-up does not necessitate outright lying, merely selective memory. 1/5 of the press directives issued by Hitler's propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels between 1939 and 1944 were orders to keep silent. They didn't involve manipulation of history or fact. They just were silence on the issues that, of course, Hitler and Goebbels and the Nazi leaders judged to be inconvenient truth. As Hassan sees it, George Orwell's 1984 already exists in many of these destructive groups. Orwell gives us a society where the main character's occupation is rewriting history for the Ministry of Truth. Big Brother knows that he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. However, this tendency to rewrite the past is not limited to totalitarian regimes like the Nazis or Stalinist Russia. Jacques Ellul points out in his brilliant book Propaganda, which I also promote, by the way, and we'll put a link to that video here. Jacques Ellul points out in Propaganda that it's inherent in propaganda itself to rewrite history. The group must minimize its own errors or flaws and magnify those of all other groups that are outside it. Thus, Ellul says, propaganda tends to make the individual live in a separate world. He must not have outside points of reference. But what if they say, that is, the propagandists, those who are promoting the cult or mind control situation, what if they say that their recruiting is merely an educational work? Everyone is free to choose and members are free to leave. Many critics of the Watchtower have brought this to the attention of Watchtower leaders who were willing to speak on camera, and that's the kind of response they usually get. People are free to join and free to leave. Well, first of all, people under mind control have no real right to choose anyway, nor freedom to leave the group. That right has been taken away from them by the refusal of the group to make full disclosure of relevant facts. Until such disclosure has been made, the cult member is a victim of religious fraud. The line between education and propaganda is sometimes vague. Lenin actually insisted that Soviet citizens needed a certain level of literacy. The illiterate are not susceptible to propaganda. That's a point made very strongly in the other video by Jacques Ellul. However, a useful means to distinguish true education from mind control is the group's capacity for receiving other points of view, and better still, the group's creating internal checks and balances to ensure the spirit of self-criticism is kept alive. Where internal dissent is squashed and external critics ignored or worse slandered, we can be sure mind control is at work. In such an environment, a phobia or fear of all outside groups and critics is created. Now, is one who has caught this phobia likely to leave the group, even if she or he has doubts about that group? In addition, there is never a legitimate reason to leave a cult. One's motives are challenged, and those who have already left are characterized as traitors to God, not just to the organization. The key for any group relying on propaganda to keep members is to maintain a closed society or environment. In such a society, however, where all information reaching the members is sanitized, often committee-composed propaganda, as in Orwell's Oceania or the Watchtower, the authoritarian leaders must often face a continuing crisis of boredom. If you've read 1984, you recognize this. It's not just the cults that have a problem with members experiencing boredom and therefore at least a mild depression. In 1984, this continent that was always under the influence of Big Brother was insidiously gray. I guess that's the best word for it. A gray culture where enjoyment and joy, even minimal peace and satisfaction, were now impossible. In the next segment, we'll talk about how do we know that the member is under a form of mind control. How do we know that we ourselves are under mind control?